And okay. And thank you to our town residents that have come too. We hope that this will be an informative session for you, so you can ask some questions.
Oh, great.
And really understand what this plan is all about as we go forward. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Lisa in a minute, but I just wanted to remind you that at the end, when Lisa is done, you're going to be able to ask
Hasn't
questions.
started yet. Oh, are they? They're at the town hall.
Okay, who's ever talking needs to mute.
Oh, but I gotta get their volume on. All right, why don't I have volume? Oh, maybe they're still hasn't officially started.
The town hall got muted if you're saying anything.
Have I been muted the whole time?
I guess, yeah, sorry.
All right, well,
Okay, start all over.
okay, I have to start all over.
Yeah.
I was muted. I welcomed to our town residents. I wanted to welcome you, and I wanted to welcome Lisa Gavoni, who is the planning board, a member of the planning board who helped create the Attainable Strategies plan. Today's meeting is so our residents can get a good sense of what this plan is and understand it. We really want you to understand it, and so you can ask questions or become active in this if you want. We will be recording this for anybody who couldn't be on today, and we will take questions after when Lisa is done. And so if you go to the chat and rather go to the raise hand feature, then Justin will call on you when Lisa is done with her presentation. Without further ado, thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. I have a pretty brief presentation. I know that we want to spend the majority of the time on the questions and answer. So again, my name is Lisa Gavoni, and I'm the housing planner for the planning department. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. And the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative began in 2021, where the prior county council requested that the planning board consider, and quote, zoning reforms that would allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in Montgomery County. And missing middle housing is basically what it sounds like. It's that in-between housing type between multifamily and single family attached. It's, housing types like duplexes, triplexes, small apartment buildings, townhouses, housing that we don't see a lot of today that was built many years ago. And Attainable Housing Strategies is the resulting effort of that request. Attainable Housing Strategies is a study. It does not have any teeth. To require it to be implemented, it would require a legislative action. And I'll talk more about this at the end, but there is, and to be very clear, there is no legislation written and there is no legislation currently under consideration. The only thing that is under consideration is the study. So the planning board really laid out 3 goals for Attainable Housing Strategies. And that first is to increase opportunities to meet the county's diverse housing supply needs and obligations, as well as the county's economic development objectives. The second is to unravel the exclusionary aspects of the county's single-family residential zones to help diversify the county's communities by diversifying the county's housing stock. And finally, the third goal was to create more opportunities for homeownerships for more households in more parts of the county. I'm going to jump right into the recommendations because I know that we have a hard stop at 1. This is a map of the R40, R60, R90, and R200 zones in Montgomery County. And these are the zones where the recommendations that will be discussed today will be applicable. A zone, every property in Montgomery County has a zone, and that zone tells you what you can do with that property. Right now in the R60, R90, and R200 zones, the predominant use of that zone is to build single-family detached housing. And now to define a couple of terms that I'll be discussing during the presentation. The first is the priority housing district. These are areas closest to the red line, purple line, Mark Station, and Thrive Montgomery 2050 growth corridors, and I'll go over those next. And that priority housing district allows reduced parking standards and allows additional unit types. And I'll discuss this more in a little bit later in the presentation. And just to be clear, the town of Somerset is in a priority housing district, so that's something to keep in mind when we discuss the recommendations. I mentioned, the Thrive Montgomery 2050 growth corridors. A couple of years ago, the Montgomery County Council approved a new general plan called Thrive Montgomery 2050. And one of that thing that general plan does is it sets out policy guidance for land use decisions in the next 30 years in Montgomery County. And one of the things that plan prioritizes is really prioritizing growth along these growth corridors. This is the areas of the county that we'll be focusing a lot of our land use efforts on in the next decades to come. So the Attainable Housing Strategies recommendations from the Planning Board focus on 3 scales of recommendations. The first is small scale, which is for the interior of single-family neighborhoods generally, and you would be allowed to build house-sized multi-unit structures like duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes by right. And what by right means is that it doesn't require planning board review or planning staff review. You can go straight to the Department of Permitting Services to get your permit with something called a pattern book. And we'll discuss the pattern book later, but a pattern book is basically a visualization of the zoning standards that we think will help facilitate the production of these types of housing. And then there's the medium scale recommendations, which we're targeting for along those growth corridors within 500 feet of them. And we're recommending a new optional method of development. And what an optional method of development does is in exchange for greater flexibility and more housing types, you subject the property to a public benefit. And in this case, the public benefit would be size limited units, an average unit size of 1,500 square feet. And you would also have to go through discretionary planning board review. So it's not by right, it requires a level of review, and that includes community engagement and outreach through the planning board public hearing. And then finally, there's the large scale recommendations, which we're targeting for growth corridor segments through the master planning process. For example, right now we're working on the University Boulevard corridor plan. I'm going to go into these a little bit more detail. So for the small scale recommendations, again, we're targeting the housing types, duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes. In Somerset, you would be allowed to build up to a quadplex. It would be allowed to be built by right, so you can go straight to the Department of Permitting Service to get your permit with conformance with that pattern book. The development standards would not change. So you would be able to build that duplex, triplex, and quadplex within the same development standards in terms of height, setback, and lot coverage that are allowed for a detached house today. And the implementation vehicle for small scale, or how this would be implemented or made into law, is something called a zoning text amendment. Now, like a bill that modifies county code, a zoning text amendment modifies the zoning code, chapter 59. There is processes to a zoning text amendment, which we'll talk a little bit about at the end, but generally there's introduction, public hearing, and work sessions. And I'm just gonna flip through these maps pretty quickly. I have a web map that I can send later if you want to zoom in. This is the areas of the county that would be allowed duplexes. And I don't think I mentioned this at the beginning, but Somerset is pretty much entirely R60. So you would be allowed to build duplexes in these parts of the county, triplexes in these parts of the county, and then quadplexes in that priority housing district closest to transit. I mentioned the pattern book a couple of times in the presentation, and a pattern book really is a visualization of the zoning code. So it will talk about things like massing, the building size, how the building articulates with the lot, something we're calling neighborly house details, which are things that we think make desirable assets to these structures, like front porches and stoops. Where the parking should be on site, we like to see it tucked behind the back so it creates a better communication with the street that the house does. Where the building should be placed on the lot, and then finally frontage design, which is how that building communicates with the street. Jumping right into medium scale, the housing type that we're targeting for our medium scale recommendations is townhouses, stacked flats, which are 2 units, one stacked on top of each other, and small apartment buildings up to 19 units. They would be allowed in the R60 in the R90 zone within 500 feet of a Thrive Montgomery 2050 identified growth corridor. And then it would be implemented through that optional method of development where the units would be size limited, but in exchange you get greater flexibility for development standards. And then this would be similarly implemented through a zoning text amendment, which again is that modification to the zoning code that would make this allowed. And this is where the attainable housing optional method would be allowed throughout the county. And zooming in on Somerset, you can see these blue parcels are within 500 feet of Wisconsin Avenue and River Road, and they would be eligible to build townhouses and small apartment buildings. And then finally, large scale is really, the densest product that we're targeting for our master planning process. Like I said, that University Boulevard corridor plan that we're working on right now, it would have the greatest flexibility for development standards similar to the CR zone, the commercial residential zones, or mixed use zones that we see today. It would again also have site plan and preliminary plan review, which requires planning staff and planning board approval. And it would be implemented through the master planning process. Other things that we're looking at is potentially creating a new zone in our zoning code that would implement the large scale recommendations. We have zones that for mixed use are densest product, but we're thinking of, is there a zone that would be more appropriate for our corridors than we have for what we have in our downtowns? So this is my everyone's least favorite part of the presentation when I talk about parking. So we are recommending reductions for parking minimums. Then if you're inside that priority housing district and there is street parking available, the project would be eligible for a 75% reduction in parking minimum. So if you look at that example, a duplex normally would have to provide 2 spaces per unit, so 4 spaces. But we are recommending that duplex unit would only have to provide 1 space. And again, this is a parking minimum, not a parking maximum. There are, the market may provide more units, or the developer may provide more parking spaces if they wish. But this is something that the planning board really wanted to push to prioritize the policy guidance that we see in Thrive. But I also know that during the listening sessions, this was probably concern number 1A, and the council president made it very clear that this is something that we will discuss at length should there be a zoning text amendment introduced. So wrapping up my presentation, I know I talk a little fast, but I wanted to make sure that I could spend enough time for questions. There's no current legislation to implement attainable housing. Nothing has been written or introduced. And should a zoning text amendment be introduced, the council could pick some of the elements that the planning board recommended, none of the elements, or all of the elements. We really don't know. Right now, the council is concentrating on summarizing the comments that they received at the listening session to synthesize them for the full council for a briefing on the topic of attainable housing, which from my understanding is going to be scheduled very soon. And should there be legislation for attainable housing strategies, the ZTA will follow the normal legislative process that will include public hearings and work sessions. And finally, thank you for having me here today. I will send this PowerPoint to Debbie because I think that there's this link on this PowerPoint that if you click, you can provide comments on attainable housing strategy to the county council. I think that the comments close pretty soon because I know they want to schedule that briefing soon. But I believe, but as of yesterday, the comment form is still open. So I would recommend any comments that you have to please send them to the county council for their consideration. But I am more than happy to answer any questions you have about the planning board's recommendations. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. That was great. I really appreciate it. I just want to underscore what you said about comments to the county council. They are actually closing their comment period on Friday, I think the 18th of in a few days. What's today?
Right.
Today the
The
16th?
16th.
Yeah, so Friday. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't give comments after this period. These comments that they're collecting by the 18th are for their first presentation. So what they'll do is they'll have a new section of collecting comments if you don't get there. But I strongly suggest that you do communicate any comments you might have, by Friday for now. And we'll keep you posted as other dates and things open up. So I will do that. So otherwise, I'm going to hand it to Justin, who's going to call on people to ask Lisa questions.
All right, so first up, we have Rohit Khanna.
There he is.
Yes, can I go ahead?
Yep.
Thank you, Justin. Lisa, thanks very much for taking the time to be with us today. And I know it's a very busy time for you, and we appreciate that you've agreed to be with us to give us more details and also to answer questions. I'd like to sort of get some thoughts from you on the sort of views of the county executive. Mark Eldridge has said that he disagrees with the proposals. He doesn't agree with the analysis. He doesn't agree with the recommendations. He has provided very specific numbers, suggesting that the master plans have enough zone capacity to meet the housing needs. The land is really not the shortage in Montgomery County. Because we're a suburb. And the real crisis is affordability, which he defines as below market housing. This doesn't address that. He talks about the fact that this sort of undoes the master planning process, which actually provides a more structured vehicle for resident input and for studying infrastructure and other costs. So I'd be interested to sort of hear from the planning department's perspective how you would respond to these very specific points that the county executive has made, and specifically on the question of need and studying impacts and how the impacts would be funded. He has pointed out that also in separate comments that the growth in and infrastructure policy doesn't really cut it. And there are serious concerns about whether the county would have the funds to pay for these infrastructure and school needs. So those are my questions. Thank you very much for your time.
Sure. Thank you for your question. I'll take those one by one. So first we can start with the zoning question. So the county executive has stated that the county has enough zoning capacity to basically meet its housing needs. And it's true that we have zoning. We have worked very hard at the planning department to implement zoning changes throughout the county. However, zoning is not a guarantee of future housing. Zoning is very often underutilized, and zoning is one tool that we have, but it's not the only thing that matters if something is, it's not the only determination if something gets built. The planning department's view is that we should continue to zone for housing because we need housing. We're in a housing shortage. And it's really important that we focus on, yes, making sure those units that we've zoned for get built, but it's also important that we look for other ways to get housing built too. The second question is about, I guess, the amount of land that we have left to build on. I strongly disagree. I think that the county's pretty much built out. I think that most people can attest to it. There is land, I guess, up county, but we don't really want to meet our climate goals. Sprawl is not the best way to do that. Sprawl is pretty damaging. It, subjects people to sitting in their cars on 270 for long hours commuting to our job centers. We think it's best to double down where we have existing infrastructure. I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the other things that you asked me.
The issue of studying the costs of further densification in terms of infrastructure and schools, and since the impact fees rarely cover the costs, and I think the county executive has come up with some numbers, or at least has expressed concerns that the county doesn't currently really have a systematic way of addressing the costs of further building out and further densification. Thank you.
Sure. So I would say that, first, I know that the county executive is, critical of the growth and infrastructure policy, but that is the vehicle to study the implementation of adequate public facilities. We can, we're in the middle of an update, but that doesn't mean that we can't do an off-cycle update. We also expect attainable housing strategies, the units, should there be legislation that passes, to operate mostly in that existing tear down rebuild market where we get about 200 a year. So implementation, would be a fraction of those 200 units a year. So we think that, production will be slow, understand that there's a cumulative effect, but we have, planned for existing check-ins. We have the growth and infrastructure policy every 4 years. We can monitor the impacts of attainable housing strategies to help mitigate for any issues with infrastructure.
Next up, we have Shannon Roback.
Oh, sorry. Hi. So I was just wondering, as part of this planning study that you guys have done, what kind of things have you looked at for stormwater management and the impact of, building more on these lots and taking away permeable spaces? And if then the county is suggesting that they do deeper, newer infrastructure to alleviate some of what would happen in terms of, the sheer volume of water in certain storms.
It's a really great question and one that's come up a lot. Because there's to take a step back, the study largely recommends zoning changes, but stormwater came up so often in our discussion that we do have a little paragraph about it. That basically says that the code's silent on what stormwater requirements there would be for multi-unit structures. We think that should change. But at the same time, stormwater is an issue now. It's not just going to be an issue for attainable housing strategy. It is an issue right now that the county needs to look at. So we are supportive of looking at potential changes, not just for attainable housing strategies, but countywide to look at this issue to hopefully, mitigate some of the issues that we're seeing today.
But then, so you guys don't have recommendations as part of this plan as to, what would, I see the parking recommendations of street parking, but there's nothing that as part of this plan that would say what would be needed to happen from a stormwater management perspective.
Nothing specific. We just say that we should update the code to make sure that these units are subject to existing stormwater requirements and that we should explore countywide changes for stormwater countywide.
Yeah, because in the town of Somerset, we have our own stormwater management that we've had to instill on top of Montgomery County because we've found that Montgomery County stormwater management is not, we need more than that. And
Right.
So I assume then if this were to go into place that our stormwater management rules that we have set up in the town of Somerset would not apply.
Your rules still apply. So there is so you have the municipalities have the ability to make things more restrictive. Unfortunately, state law is a little bit unclear right now of what that means for multi-unit, but there is conversations with state representatives to make sure that the same protections that exist for single family detached for municipalities exist for multi-unit too. So we're hoping that those changes go through.
Okay, and so is that going to be as part of like the whole county looking at this and deciding whether or not to take this up? Like, does that get put into it, or is that a separate thing?
And that's state law.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Roback. Next up, we have Derek Weiss.
Hello, this is Derek. I'm on Fallstone. My camera's not working, so I apologize for that. I was interested in the difference in wording between missing middle housing and attainable housing. I personally find the missing middle phrase to be more understandable and more descriptive of what's going on. I'm interested in why the Housing Authority changed the wording and whether they meant anything by that.
That's a really great question. That's actually a question I haven't really received before, and I've done like 30 of these. So that's I think that the term missing middle, we are hoping that through this that middle housing is no longer missing. And it says a marketing term, missing middle, was coined by Opticos Design to describe, house scale multi-unit structures. And generally, we're talking about, those structures, but also small apartment buildings and other types of structures. So it's just a broader term. As for why we use the term attainable, I can't tell you why. I believe what happened is that we were looking for a different term so that we could avoid using Opticos's marketing term. And our former planning director liked the term attainable housing. I wish I had like a deeper understanding of why we used it, but that's the best I can give you, unfortunately.
Okay, and then if I
I
can,
agree. I think middle housing is probably a little bit clearer than, and if we could go back in time, I would bet that we would not be using attainable housing because we get a lot of questions about why we're using that term.
and I actually think that the phrase missing middle is very helpful because it does feel like it smuggles in the conclusion that the housing is missing. And so I'm interested in what work the authority's done, if any, to determine whether or not that's missing and how I can understand that.
Sure. So there is, existing middle housing in Montgomery County. East County is a really great example. The Kentlands too also has a decent amount of these housing units, although that's in the city of Gaithersburg, so we don't have zoning authority over them. We do have, duplexes in places like Wheaton, Tacoma Park, small apartment buildings in East Silver Spring, but they haven't been built with regularity in probably 50, 60 years. So we're hoping these units are not so missing anymore.
All right. At the moment, nobody has their hand raised. We can go back to Rohit Khanna.
Oh, I don't want to come back again if there's somebody else in line ahead of me. So I can hold off and come back again because I've already asked my questions. I had some follow-up questions for Lisa, but I can wait, Justin, if somebody else needs to go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Right now we have Liz B. Like to comment, ask a question.
Hi. Thanks for taking my question. I have a couple questions. I noticed that in the big 100-page document, there's no discussion of historic preservation. How does does this plan really not care about historic neighborhoods or any kind of tradition of our neighborhoods anymore? It just seems to kind of throw historic preservation concepts kind of under the bus in terms of, maybe that's not PC with equity concerns here. Because, these neighborhoods were developed as single family neighborhoods, which are now labeled kind of racist. And this problem with equity that you're trying to attack, which, you know, the neighborhoods around here are old. And a lot of us want to preserve them as they are. And it seems the fact that your document doesn't discuss historic preservation or preservations of communities at all is really problematic.
Sure. So I agree. We should have included a section on historic preservation. We didn't include it because, to be honest, nothing about historic preservation is going to change. Your historic area work permit is still required for alterations within most locally designated historic districts or designated historic sites. The HPC would review proposals for construction, addition, modifications, grading, and tree removal using existing adopted design guidelines for properties within the district. I'm not an expert on historic preservation, but I can give you the contact of our historic preservation supervisor for more specific questions. I was in Kensington last night talking about attainable housing, and this also came up. We did add a section to our FAQ about historic preservation, understanding that it probably was an oversight on our part to not include it in the report. So I apologize for that. That was not our intention.
So next up, we have Councilmember Heller.
Lisa, I have a couple of questions. I think these might be easy questions. The 500 feet designation on a growth corridor, am I correct in assuming then that you can only build from Wisconsin Avenue or Greystone Avenue up 500 feet? It can't just be in the middle of the neighborhood because we're part of the growth corridor. Am I correct about that?
Correct.
Correct. Okay. In that case, would we be designated as small scale here or medium scale here? This is Somerset specific.
So Somerset would largely be small scale, but there are some within the 500-foot buffer from, what is that?
Wisconsin
and River.
Right. That's coming off Greystone Avenue and River.
Right.
I think those are only two, if I'm correct.
You're correct. Yes, I'm looking at the map right now.
And so the rest of us, though, are considered small scale?
Yes.
Okay, so the medium, when you talked about medium scale and 500 feet, 1,500 square feet in an apartment, that doesn't mean us. So if I were to knock down my house and want to put 2 units on it, let's say 2 little side-by-side townhouses, I'm not constrained by the 1,500 foot, designation. Am I right?
If you're only allowed to do the medium scale within 500 feet of a growth corridor, so Wisconsin and River Road, anywhere the interior of a single family neighborhood, you'd be limited to a quadplex.
Okay, so what's to stop a developer from coming in here, knocking down my house, or maybe I'm the developer, and I put up 2 townhouses and I follow suit like they did behind Trader Joe's, the old Trader Joe's, where the developer knocked down a house and put up 3 townhouses and is charging $3.5 million a house. Is there anything that stops a developer from doing that here in Somerset?
Sure. So for the medium scale, the units are size limited. So when people use the Wall Street example of the $3 million townhouses, those were almost 4,000 square feet. So they're quite bigger than the townhouses that would be recommended in attainable housing strategies. There is no size limitation for small scale, but I think that's something that we will discuss with the council. But there is a size limitation for that medium scale structure.
But we're not, that only pertains to the 500 feet in from the growth corridor. The
Right.
rest of the neighborhood, which is most of us, we are small scale, in terms of your designation, and there is no square footage designation then, so I can knock down my house and put up 2 lovely townhouses as big as I can get it, as whatever the rules are gonna let me, and then I can charge whatever I want. Therefore, most likely, no house that went up in this neighborhood would ever be considered attainable, if that's
That's
the
true,
case.
yes.
So my question is, to throw this back at the planning board when this does come back to you, is what makes this an attainable plan? It's
Sure, so
not,
I think that's a good question. It's one we get a lot. So I think there's a couple of things. I think one, attainability looks different throughout the county. What it can be built in Somerset is not the case countywide. I also think that we're seeing a lot of transformation of our neighborhoods through the tear down rebuild process, and we're trying to make a competitive process to that tear down rebuild process. Right now, there's nothing stopping someone from tearing down a home and putting up a, $2 million McMansion, but comparatively, a duplex or a triplex would be, significantly cheaper than that new McMansion that could be built right now. So it's just trying to make a competitive process to that existing process today.
I understand that, and I understand the thinking behind it and the heartfelt thinking about what you're trying to do. But realistically, in this neighborhood, in the neighborhoods all around down here in Chevy Chase and close in Bethesda, that will not be the case. We will be a developer's dream. And, so that's really just, I'm editorializing. And I think my last question then would be, Wisconsin, 355 is the growth corridor. Down here, we call 355 Wisconsin Avenue, but is it considered 355?
I think generally those terms are used interchangeably.
Okay, that's the end of my questions. What about anybody else?
Yes, Mayor Slavin.
So is that the conclusion? Has everybody?
Well, I think we have some questions over
We
here.
have some more questions.
Oh, yeah, then I think Councilmember Barr wants to ask a question. So can you go to the
Podium.
podium?
Yeah, otherwise you won't be able to hear you.
Yeah.
Yes. Imagine you're a builder just now is what I'm asking. And builders obviously are trying to make a profit when they build. And so they're going to build the most expensive place they can build in order to reap the most profit. But the real crisis at the moment is in affordable homes. The first home for people to move into. It means that they're not going to be able to afford those expensive homes. So what kind of incentives are we putting in place to get builders to build more affordable homes? That's really what it comes down to.
That's a great question. I would say for the Attainable Housing Strategy, there's no incentive currently. We have talked about, so one of the things that, Habitat for Humanity, for example, brought up is like, they're supportive of attainable housing strategies because their product is largely single-family detached homes. But if they could build a duplex, the subsidy required is a lot less. They did build a duplex project in Tacoma Park, but they had some issues with permitting that made it really, really difficult. And also was hard to fit in with the existing development standards. So some of the things that we'll probably talk about with County Council is optional incentives for affordable housing. I think that we should, honestly. I think that, when you have affordable housing providers telling you that they support this, but they also think that there should be some baked in incentives to make these units affordable, I think we should listen to them.
So Nancy Sussman, I saw you had your hand raised. Would you still like to speak?
Yes, thank you. I think the point that, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I think the point that Debbie made is sort of the key point, that this plan seems to increase density without ensuring attainable housing.
So you guys have to mute at the town hall. I think you need to mute your computer because you can hear her 2 times. Sorry.
Do I need to should I repeat or not?
Do you have a question though? This is about
Yes.
This is about Q&A.
Yes, my question is, am I correct that what this proposed plan does is increase density without ensuring in any way attainable pricing?
Sure, I think for the small scale, there probably is no guarantee for attainability, but I think the size limitations for the medium scale of 1,500 square feet would create some inherent attainability given the size of the units.
When you talk about small scale, which would be within the town of Somerset, the house across the street from me on Greystone Street is a good, I think is a good example of basically a 3-story house that people in the neighborhood might want to come by just to see what that feels like and get that sense of scale. Sorry, that was a comment. I have one more question. Am I correct that the Council of Governments didn't find a need for housing? And so the increase in housing that the county is recommending is precipitated by a need for attainable or more affordable housing. It's not for numbers of housing, it's for type of housing.
That's a great question. So the Council of Government found that the region is short hundreds of thousands of units. Montgomery County, based on the work that the Council of Governments did, set a housing target goal in 2019 for 31,000 units by 2030. Of that goal, 75% should be affordable to low and moderate income households. But moderate income households is defined as up to 150% of area median income, which is about 250,000 for a household of 4. So the work that we've done at the county has been based on the COG work, but I think there's just been a little bit of misunderstanding about the nuance and the details in it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Next up is Ann Bolton.
Thank you. Apologies, Lisa, if this is somewhere in the bigger report that I haven't had a chance to look at, but I live in Somerset, but have a office space in Friendship Heights, and which is obviously right next to the metro station here. And, there's a glut of basically empty and virtually abandoned commercial buildings here. It's sort of a zoning disaster in this area. So I guess my question is, I'm trying to understand the rationale for this plan and why it's not focused on addressing the glut of empty office space, which is right at the metro, and focusing housing strategies, particularly affordable housing strategies, right next to the metro, as opposed to a mile away from the metro and targeting single-family homes. Thank you.
It's a great question. So I have a project for you right now. We just kicked off the Friendship Heights master plan. So we will be looking at the area in Friendship Heights, especially the vacant office space for changes to zoning. That process just kicked off. I can send you contact information if you'd love to stay informed. I think we're doing what the council asked us to do, which is to study diversifying our housing options in our single family neighborhoods. I think that it's not an or situation, it's an and situation we have right now, that we're in such a dire housing crisis that we need to kind of do all hands on deck, looking at what you suggested, looking at those vacant office spaces in Friendship Heights and the zoning there to make sure that we can also strategize to build housing in the downtown too.
Mark Peerless.
Thank you. And thank you, Lisa. Could you explain the 1,500 square foot or the average 1,500 square foot limit for those properties within 500 feet of the major corridors? Are there additional restrictions that would preclude those units from all being built for single people, the way most of the units in downtown Bethesda are, and where you can charge a premium with all the premium finishings and everything else. How are you going to get families that need the attainable or affordable housing into those units?
Sure. So it's an average unit size. So you can build some bigger and some smaller as long as they average out to 1,500. I would also say, you know, the typical house in Montgomery County that was built in the 1950s is around 1,500, 1,600 square feet today. So people are raising families in them right now. I know that, you know, it may not seem like the market is not providing those units right now. I think the market is generally providing much larger single family detached homes upwards of 4,000 square feet. But I think that there's room in the market for those smaller units that for, you know, we know that size has a big impact on affordability. So if you can make them smaller and, you know, people are able to get, you know, a door into home ownership, I think that was our goal.
Well, but my question's a little different than that.
Sure.
Is there any evidence that 1,500 square foot or units in downtown Bethesda apartment towers contain any attainable or affordable housing for families, as opposed to units that are geared towards one or two people to live in them?
That's an interesting question. You know, the average unit size in Bethesda is shrinking. It's not really 1,500 square feet. That's a pretty big apartment. So I don't really know of any examples of apartments being built that big. We're seeing mostly like studios and one bedrooms and some twos, but we don't really see family size units anymore, which is another issue, I think, with how housing is being built today. So I don't think I have enough data to answer your question.
Well, how is it then that the Planning Commission can recommend a change like this when the limit that's being relied upon to drive attainable housing, when there's no, you know, clear evidence that in this down county region the developers will build housing that will be attractive to small families rather than to young professionals living a single lifestyle. That's what I don't understand about the plan.
Sure. I think that we were also asked to look for ways to make zoning changes for housing units that are types that we're not seeing, and that includes smaller housing. So it's not just, you know, we don't have the data, it's that we're trying to look for ways to make these units available on the market. I think that, you know, I think you bring up a really interesting question is, you know, 1,500 the right size square feet. The answer is, you know, I don't know. Maybe we start with 1,500 and the market's not providing them, we change it. But I think that, you know, knowing what we know about the impact that size does have on affordability, the planning board decided to recommend 1,500 square feet.
When you say what do you know about it, what part of the county does your evidence come from that a 1,500 square foot limit will attract the builders to provide or to offer attainable housing for young families, as opposed to housing geared towards young professionals who will pay premiums for the location and for the finishings and for the layout of the units, which would be very different than in a family facility. And so if down county no one builds 1,500 square foot units, there must be a reason for that. Why would that suddenly change under this plan?
Sure. So I think that we can, there is some evidence, first, I think there's nothing wrong with young professionals moving into, they need housing too. I attest from a young professional myself who would someday like to aspire to home ownership in this county. I look at the example, there's an office to residential conversion in downtown Silver Spring that built smaller than market units. A lot of them were micro units, but there were some in the 700 to 800 range. And because of how they were built and the sizes of the units, about 80% of them, from what I remember, went to first-time home buyers and had household incomes below 80% at or below, the 80 to 100% of area median income range. So I think it is possible, and I think that there is a need for that type of unit. Now, will the market respond to the way that we hope it does? I can't answer that. All I can say is, that's our hope.
But why would you be recommending policy changes that destroy single-family neighborhoods based on a hope?
Well, I think that these changes, I think we were asked to study the options to diversify housing stock. That was the ask of the county council, and we're fulfilling that ask. So I think that's point one. I think that a lot of other jurisdictions have made similar changes. I don't see this as, destroying single-family neighborhoods. If you want to build a single-family detached home, there's nothing stopping you. But you should be able to build another type of housing if you want. Not everyone aspires to a detached home. Some people, we've heard a lot from people that want to age in place and be able to convert their houses to duplexes. So there's other options too. I do say that there's a couple of other people that have questions, and we only have a couple minutes left. So I'm happy to give you my email if you would rather chat after.
Thank you very much.
So next up is Rohit Khanna.
Thanks very much. Yeah, I think I've got to say, Lisa, I'm not really persuaded by the argument that there is a shortage of housing. This generalization, there's no data that backs that up. I think all the data shows that the problem is affordability, especially for people in certain income groups. You referred to the target of 21,000 by 2030. I've seen this memo that from OLO, the Office of Legislative Oversight, that says that about 13,000 homes have been built between 2020 and 2023. So at the current rate of building of 3,200 new homes per year, the county is on track to meet whatever target, whether it's 21,000 or 35,000 or 30,000, those numbers are going to be met. Even assuming that 25% of permitted units aren't built, it'll still achieve that. In fact, by the way, that data on the OLO memo showed that between 76 and 83% of permits get built. So it isn't true that 50% won't get built. So the problem bluntly is the affordability crisis, not a housing crisis as such generalized. So, I haven't seen anything in any data anywhere that shows that Montgomery County is not on track to provide sufficient housing. The bottom line is Montgomery County cannot provide enough housing for people at 65% of AMI. That's the crisis. Now, here's the last point I'll make. I think that there needs to be a proper economic analysis. Going back to Mark's point, you can't do policy on a hope and a prayer. You have to do proper economic studies of these things. Now, there are many unintended consequences when public policy interferes in the marketplace to try to solve a market failure. If you say that people want to live in duplexes or triplexes, sure. But people also want to live in single-family homes. So converting teardowns away from single-family homes means fewer single-family homes in Montgomery County. So unless you've done a study that shows that the demand for single-family detached homes in Montgomery County is going to decline proportionately to the amount of new multifamily dwellings, the price of single-family homes will go up. So there are a lot of unintended consequences that have to be studied in a proper economic analysis. You talk about, there only will be 200 tear downs per year, this is a manageable number. Well, yes, it's a manageable number if you spread it across Montgomery County. But if 50 out of those 200 are in one planning area, the concentrated effects are very different from countywide. So one has to really look at the cumulative impacts, the concentrated impacts. One has to look at the broader economic impacts of how markets respond to policy levers. And what I haven't seen is an analysis that does that. And so my main concern is that, going to what Mark said earlier, we don't know how the market will respond, but there's a very high risk that the market will respond in a way that will, in fact, undermine the supply of affordable housing, because there's also the possibility that developers are going to see this attainable housing as much more profitable than providing affordable housing. There's only so much capital, labor, and material that's available. So if they have permits for more attainable housing, they're going to walk away from every permit they've got for affordable housing, because why would they do affordable housing when they can make 12, 14, 15% profit margins on attainable housing? This all needs to be studied. And so my question really is, I hope that the planning board, the planning department, and the county will take the time to do these thoughtful, necessary studies, because right now there seems to be too much on a hope and a prayer, and the data just doesn't add up. I mean, I'm taking numbers from Montgomery County government documents that show that the rate of building is sufficient. So I think, we as residents, as citizens of Montgomery County, sort of need more data-driven, and less hope and prayer-driven policy. Thanks.
Sure. So can I respond to that? I think, one, we have done a lot of economic analysis. We've done a lot of analysis on the tear down rebuild market. We've looked at other jurisdictions and what's happening there. I would also say the Department of Permitting Services data also shows that most of the units being built are multifamily, not a single family attached and detached, and there is a demand. We've done a forecast and a housing needs assessment that looks at the demand for these types of units. We've done a lot of work over the past 4 years on this issue. And I think that, if I understand that there are some people that don't think that there's a housing crisis. A normal housing market does not have an average detached home that goes over $1 million. That's not normal. An average home in Montgomery County sells in 13 days. That's not a normal housing market. We don't have enough supply of housing. An average housing market doesn't have 60% of their houses that go on the market sell in 0 days on the market, or less than 10 days, excuse me. It's not unhealthy.
Lisa, but just generalizing about average markets, I mean, Montgomery County and the DC area is not average in terms of.
It's not a healthy housing market. It's not. You know that it's not.
It's an affordability crisis. As I said, there's no evidence at all that their own numbers show that we are building at enough rates to meet the demand.
And multifamily.
So there we are. So that's what this attainable housing is trying to push, is more multifamily. You already have more than enough multifamily demand being met.
How many of those permits were for duplexes or triplexes? Zero. I think that, we're running out of time. You can certainly contact me for email if you have any follow-up questions. But I think that there's if we want to end, or you want me to take the last 2 questions?
I was going to cut it off at this point, but if you want to take the last 2 questions, if they promise to be questions, that's fine, okay? If it's okay with you, Lisa.
Sure.
All right, then Liz B. Liz? Okay, how about Derek? Derek, you had a question?
Thank you.
Sorry. I had a hard time unmuting. I do have a question. I know you've heard about 1 billion people talk about affordability, that many people do view the problem in Montgomery County as one of affordability. And I, like many others, really have a problem with the tear downs that we see. Every time we see, like many other people, get a stomachache when we see a house torn down and replaced with one triple the size and quadruple the cost, quadruple the market price. To me, it seems that what is being torn down is actually the affordable housing. And my question is, has the planning department considered some disincentives to tear downs? Either a ban on tear downs or a demolition surcharge ordinance to provide disincentives to tear downs. I know this is going on in Chicago. You're probably aware of what's going on, these anti-gentrification laws in like Logan Square in Humboldt Park in Chicago. And that's where those communities are very concerned about the tear downs and the affordability crisis in those neighborhoods. And they're attacking it from a completely different, opposite direction. And has the planning department considered that? And would you consider that for our communities? Because the developers are just using us and destroying our neighborhoods from a completely different point of view and destroying the affordability that we want to maintain.
Sure. So I'll answer that really quickly. Is that there is a disincentive in the zoning code for tear downs. It's called infill compatibility standards that doesn't let them fill up the lot as much. There was a task force that looked at this issue a number of years ago. It didn't really, and that was pretty much, from what I remember, like the only recommendation that came out of it. I think that, a demolition tax is something that we should look into. I think, that would be a bill, not a zoning tax amendment. So planning wouldn't take the lead on that. That would be the executive branch. But it's something that, sure, I think that, separate from this, we could look into too.
Okay, one last question from Derek, and then I'm going to close this.
Thank you. You mentioned earlier you think this is a dire housing crisis, and you mentioned some statistics when you're talking to Rohit. Can you specifically define what you think the crisis is that this policy is addressing?
Sure. So I think it's a couple of things. I think first, it's supply. Even though, we think, implementation will be slow at best, I think about changes that we made to accessory dwelling units in 2019, where we doubled the amount that are being built, and that lets people age in place. I think that it also helps unravel the exclusionary aspects of single family zoning, which is, an equity tool. I also think that, I mentioned supply, equity. I also think there's an issue of, housing choice in this county, that there is, there's not a lot of options for households or families in between, a detached home. Our housing stock is about 50% detached homes right now. So I think that being able to provide different housing types for different people in different stages of your life is important. So I think it hits on a couple of things, but I appreciate your question.
Well, I want to thank Lisa especially for coming out. I want to thank our residents for coming out to watch, listen, and ask good questions. I encourage everyone to do two things. And one is to write to the county council by Friday. And I know I sent out an email. I sent out an email on that, and so did our town manager, where that information is. If you don't have it, just let me know, and I'll send it out again. And also I encourage you to come to one of our listening sessions that are set up. I know the first one is next Monday at 5 o'clock.
Yeah, October 21st.
No, it's 7
o'clock.
At 7 o'clock. And the next one is
October 23rd at 5 o'clock p.m. And then the last one is October 29th at noon.
And what we're going to do is, it's not to ask questions, but to give us your opinion, so the town of Somerset can take a position and represent that to the county council. So with that, if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to call on me or any of the other council members. And thank you again, Lisa, for your time. Have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.